So in today's class, we turn our attention to a new book, a book by Desmond Tutu and his daughter, Mpho Tutu. And the book is entitled The Book of Forgiving, the Fourfold Path for Healing Ourselves and Our World. Now, the focus of this video and the focus of our class will really be on the central section of Tutu's book called The Fourfold Path. But it is the central section. There's three sections, part 1, part 2, part 3. Part 1 is entitled Understanding Forgiveness. And there's some introductory chapters on why people forgive, things like what forgiveness is not. Things that by now should be pretty familiar to the class, things that were covered right in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on forgiveness, in Robert Enright's book, in Charles Griswold's book, and in Anthony Bash's book. So I really won't be talking about that. The second part, that central section, is on the fourfold path to forgiveness, and that will be the focus of my presentation today, and so I'll circle back to that in just a moment. And part 3 is entitled All Can Be Forgiven, and it has some chapters on more discrete topics related to forgiveness. One is a chapter on what we do, what we need to do when we need to be forgiven. Tutu's chapter is actually quite similar to Enright's chapter that we looked at on the same topic. It also has a chapter on self-forgiveness. So I just want to let you know that there's a part 3, good stuff for you to read, but I won't be talking about those today. I'm rather going to focus on that central section, the fourfold path to forgiveness. So we turn our attention to the fourfold path of forgiveness. And I should first say that Tutu's book, the whole book really, is filled with personal stories, with stories from South Africa, and with practical suggestions for journal exercises, for meditations, and for prayers. So this makes this book, I think, very engaging, very, very readable, and also very helpful. It has lots of helpful suggestions, I think, for applying these insights about forgiveness into our own lives and for our own spiritual growth and our growth in the practice of forgiveness. So if you want to go deeper, read the book. It's really quite good and quite helpful. For the purpose of this video and for our class, however, I'm just going to try to give an overview of the major steps in the fourfold path. So I'll begin by naming the 4 steps in the fourfold path, and then I'll circle back to each and say a bit more. So the first step is telling the story. And here the focus is on the facts and telling the truth, right? The beginning of our journey towards healing is telling the truth about the harm that has occurred to us. So telling the story is the first step. The second step on the fourfold path is naming the hurt. Naming the hurt. So building on the facts of the matter and the truthful telling of the story, we name the hurt that has happened to us, right? Healing begins when we name the feelings that are part of the story of the harm that has been done to us. So second is naming the hurt. The third step on the fourfold path is granting forgiveness. Granting forgiveness, right? For Tutu, forgiveness is a choice. And in this chapter, Tutu explains the nature of forgiveness and the process of granting forgiveness. So that third step, granting forgiveness. And the fourth step on the fourfold path is renewing or releasing the relationship. Renewing or releasing the relationship. And so in this step, Tutu discusses the choice we make either to renew the relationship with the one who has harmed us and seek reconciliation, or the choice we make to release the relationship and not seek reconciliation with the person who has harmed us. So the four steps on the fourfold path are telling the story, naming the feelings, granting forgiveness, and renewing or releasing the relationship. So now I want to circle back to the first step in the fourfold path, which is telling the story. And the first step in forgiveness is telling the truth, right? Telling the truth. Think here, right? Tutu was the leader of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and the foundation of that whole work, as he says, is the truth, right? The truth must be told if there is to be healing. So as he says, we must first let the truth be heard in all its rawness, in all its ugliness, in all its messiness. Telling the truth prevents us from pretending that the things that did happen didn't happen. So, how do we tell the truth? Well, he says to tell the truth, we begin with the facts. But he says that after a trauma, we may need to work on this because the facts of the story of our harm may be fragmented, right? We may need to tell our story over and over again so that we can get the facts sorted, so that we can get the truth out, right? And this is really important, this first step, because he gives examples of if we try to suppress our story, if we try to suppress the truth, these things can harm us. Right? So we need to tell our story. We have to first focus on the facts. He says as we work on this process of telling the truth, on telling our story, we may need to find a first safe place to tell our story, right? We may need to begin by telling our story to a close friend or a loved one or a trusted person, like a therapist or a counselor, right? So oftentimes it becomes helpful to tell our story, to tell our truth, to tell it in a safe place, in the context of someone who will accept and hear us as we try to sort out the truth of our story, the truth of the harm that has happened to us. Tutu does say that it would be important, if possible, if safe, to tell our story to the person who has harmed us, right? Only if it is safe to do so. Now, there's a risk, of course, that the person may deny that they did anything to us, but Tutu is always kind of seeing forgiveness as moving towards reconciliation. And so he thinks it's important that we tell our story, that we tell the truth, and that if we are going to move towards reconciliation, that we tell this to the person who has harmed us. He also says for some people in their healing, it may be important to find ways in which to tell their story publicly. He gives examples of people who tell the story of the type of harm they've experienced and their journey towards healing and forgiveness in public ways, to share their story with people who have gone through similar experiences so that they too can find healing and forgiveness. So that might be an important part of telling our story, telling it publicly. And the last thing that he says about this first step, telling our story, is that as we tell our story, we also have to accept the fact that whatever has happened in the past to us, the harm that has happened, cannot be changed or undone, right? We need to accept this stubborn fact that history moves only in one direction, right? The horrible thing happened to us, and I cannot change that. What we can do is accept the truth of what happened to us and then try to move forward towards healing through the process of forgiveness and reconciliation. So the next step, the second step on the fourfold path, is naming the hurt. Naming the hurt. So in this step, we identify the feelings with the facts of the story, right? So we started in the first step by telling the story, where we tried to get the facts straight and where we told the truth. In this second step, we now try to identify the feelings that are associated with the story of our harm. So Tutu says it's important to name the hurt, because if we don't, it will fester and perhaps even rupture, right? So unnamed hurt can wreak havoc on our health, on our families, on our jobs, on our relationships, on our faith. And Tutu thinks that the only way to heal the hurt is to give voice to it, right? The only way to heal the hurt is to give voice to it. So naming the hurt is how we begin to repair our brokenness, how we begin to repair the brokenness that has come when we have been harmed. So as we begin to try to name our feelings, Tutu reminds us that no feeling is wrong or bad or invalid. No feeling is wrong or bad or invalid in relationship to the harm that has been done to us. So we need to feel safe to name whatever we are feeling if we are to move forward. And to do this, we need to find someone who will acknowledge us and listen to us and to our feelings without trying to fix them and without judgment, right? We need to find someone we can talk to and share our feelings, who will not try to fix our problems or minimize our loss or offer advice or respond with their own stories of experience of loss and trauma and pain, right? We need someone who will simply listen to us without judgment as we name the feelings associated with our harm. So Tutu thinks it would be a good thing, maybe in an ideal world, we would name our feelings to the perpetrator. Tutu really does think that this is an important thing, is to tell the truth to the perpetrator and to name our feelings to the perpetrator. But he also acknowledges that this will not always be possible, nor will it be safe And so in that case, we need to find a safe person with whom we can share our feelings, right? A trusted friend, a family member, a counselor, a spiritual advisor, a clergy person. So Tutu says in this process of naming the hurt, we are reclaiming our dignity, right? We are building something new from the wreckage of what was lost. So in this process of naming our hurt, Tutu says we are moving toward accepting our vulnerability, right? We heal as we choose to move forward and are brave and vulnerable enough to feel. And so accepting our vulnerability is key in this second step as we name the hurt, because we accept the fact that we are vulnerable human beings who feel and who feel pain and loss and grief. And so that's an important part of the healing, accepting our vulnerability. He also says that accepting our vulnerability is a way in which we can stay in relationship with others, right? When people share their vulnerability with each other, they find a way to stay in relationship and to be healed. So that's really where he leaves this second step. And he says that as we go through this process of naming the hurt, we move forward to the next step, the third step, granting forgiveness only when we feel ready. So that's that second step in the fourfold process, naming the hurt. So now we turn to the third step on the fourfold path, and that step is granting forgiveness. Granting forgiveness. So for Tutu, forgiveness is a choice. And we'll remember way back in the beginning when we talked about Robert Enright, the title of his book was Forgiveness is a Choice. So for Tutu as well, forgiveness is a choice. Tutu says sometimes forgiveness will come quickly, but other times forgiveness will come slowly. But he says, in order to move on this path towards healing, we must choose to forgive. So in choosing to forgive, Tutu says we move from being a victim to a hero. Right? In choosing to forgive, we find freedom from the endless loop of telling our stories and naming our hurts. Right? Choosing to forgive allows us to determine our own fate and our own future. Right? A victim, says Tutu, has no choices to make. A hero has the strength and the ability to become generous and forgiving. So in choosing to forgive, we move from victims to heroes. So in granting forgiveness, Tutu says we are able to forgive when we recognize our common humanity with the perpetrator, right? We recognize that we are all fragile, flawed, vulnerable human beings. And we also recognize that no one is born evil, and that we are all more than the worst thing we have done, right? Humans are a mixture of generous and selfish natures. So Tutu gives us a number of stories and ways to reflect on our common humanity. So we can grant forgiveness when we recognize our common humanity and see the lives of our perpetrator in a larger context. Again, this reminds us of Enright's third phase as well, seeing the wrongdoer in a larger context, their childhood, their adolescence, their common humanity, maybe even how God sees them. Now, again, Tutu says, like Enright, this is not to justify or excuse or condone the wrongdoing. Rather, it is to help us understand the perpetrator and the wrongdoing in a larger framework. So Tutu really doesn't define true forgiveness. Rather, he says you'll know it in a variety of ways when it happens. So if it feels like a huge weight has lifted, that may be true forgiveness. If it feels like an overwhelming sense of peace, that may be forgiveness. If you now wish the perpetrator well, that may be forgiveness. And if you feel a new sense of freedom, that also may be true forgiveness. So, all these things are part of true forgiveness, and we'll know it, I guess, when we feel it. Tutu says that we know we are healing in this fourfold path towards healing when we are able to tell a new story, right? Remember, we began by telling the story. Now we're able to tell a new story, right? And our new story includes seeing the perpetrator in a new light, right? We reframe them and their wrongdoing in this larger narrative of our common humanity, perhaps some things we know about them. But we also are telling a new story about ourselves, right? And in this new story, we change from being victims to heroes. So we tell a story in which through forgiveness, our lives are ennobled, right? In our new story, we grow in strength and compassion and empathy and character. So that's the third step on the fourfold path. That step is granting forgiveness. So we are now at the fourth step on the fourfold path. And the fourth step is renewing or releasing the relationship. Renewing or releasing the relationship. So after granting forgiveness, Tutu says we have a choice to either renew the relationship or release the relationship. Tutu says, or he believes, that the preference should always be towards renewing the relationship and reconciliation, except in those cases where safety is an issue. But sometimes we may need to release a relationship. So what is releasing a relationship? As Tutu has said, there are times when trying to renew a relationship will not be appropriate, such as when it will lead to further harm. So here we choose to not have someone in our lives anymore. And truly releasing someone, truly releasing a relationship happens when we let them go without wishing them harm. We release someone, as he says, when we refuse to let an experience or a person occupy a space in our heads or in our hearts any longer, right? So we can grant people forgiveness, but we can also choose to release the relationship, okay? But the preference, as Tutu said, is always for renewing a relationship. So what is renewing a relationship? So Tutu says renewing a relationship is not to go back to where it was before the wrongdoing. Rather, what we do when we renew a relationship is create a new relationship out of our suffering, right? And oftentimes he thinks the renewed relationship can be stronger because of what we have experienced. Now, to renew a relationship, Tutu believes that the person who has been wronged or harmed must ask the perpetrator for what he or she needs, right? We may need an apology. We may need an expression of remorse. We may need an explanation. We may need restitution. We may need some recompense. So if we are going to have a renewed relationship, we need to ask the perpetrator for what we need. Okay? Tutu also says, to renew a relationship, we may also need to examine our own part in the conflict, right? We may have done some things that have contributed to the breaking or fracture of the relationship as well. If we do these things, if the perpetrator and the victim do these things, we may find a renewed relationship that is deeper because we have faced the truth, we have recognized our common humanity, and now we can tell a new story of a transformed relationship. So this is the last step on the fourfold path, which is the renewing or the releasing of the relationship. So that's the fourfold path, and just to remember, the fourfold path has 4 steps. The first step is telling the story. The second step is naming the hurt. The third step is granting forgiveness. And the fourth step is renewing the relationship or releasing the relationship.